Welcome back, Storytime with me. Sorry about the wee break, it's been a hectic few days. Hopefully I'll get a few recordings done today and we're guaranteed on the roll for at least another week. Sorry, I'm a bit sick at the moment, so there might be a few nose blows and that awesome throaty voice in the way, but I'm sure we'll get through it. Alright, on to it we go. Chapter 3, Civil War. But my career in Ecuador had its political as well as its commercial side, in order to trace which I must hark back to my Salinas days. One day, shortly after Alfaro started his revolution, I happened to be in Guaranda on business. It was market day, and the plaza was full of Indians selling everything from saddles to lard, including codfish glue and gents' neckwear. Suddenly, there was a tearing down of awnings and a general stampede. It took me some time to discover that the Pretender's invading army was to be seen coming along a valley 8 or 10 miles away. The populace disappeared and the troops were called out. The latter proceeded to the edge of the town, lay down and opened fire. I followed to see the fun. They were shooting with their sights at 50 yards, and a number of them were using 8mm cartridges in an 11mm rifle. I took pity on them, showed them something about the rudiments of marksmanship, and, involuntarily, became associated with the government forces in the bloody civil war which followed. I may mention that while in Quito some months later, when it was all over and Alfaro was president, I learned from the official statistics that 10 million rounds of ammunition were used up, while the only casualty was a man who was kicked by a mule. Those unacquainted with that type of warfare should not be surprised, for the fact was that if the noise and smoke of the rifles of the defending force did not scare away the attackers before they came within extreme range, they, the defenders, either evacuated the town or changed their clothes and marched out with the brass band to meet the invaders, shouting "Viva Alfaro!" That was exactly what happened in Guaranda. When the defenders saw that the revolutionary column kept coming on, they soon gave up firing, long before the enemy could have become aware of their desperate resistance. The defence melted away, and the officers who had been feverishly directing the fire swapped their swords for no more harmful instruments than piccolos and drums. As Alfaro's army marched into the music of the defenders' band, I stood and watched the show. The officers, who had surely been as heavily coated in dust as the rank and file a few minutes before, sparkled in their scintillating uniforms, neither they nor their sleek horses showing any wear and tear from the long dusty trail. In violent contrast were the common soldiers, an ununiformed, hatless, bootless, ragged rabble. Some of the more fortunate had picked up animals on the road, horses, mules, and donkeys, some of which had no skin on their backs, while others had frying pans and other utensils slung round their necks, clashing like cymbals as they walked. Some of the less fortunate animals carried 2, or even 3 men. There were even donkeys with 2 riders facing ahead and 1 astern. Quite half the army had rifles, while the rest were following in their wake in the hope of a good square meal. A few days after I had returned to Salinas, for I was still working there at the time, a party of some 20 picked officers arrived at my mountain home on horseback to arrest me, bringing with them a warrant. But I was waiting for them, for one of my Indians had warned me of their approach. When I showed myself at the door of my hut with my Winchester, they halted about 50 yards away and saluted. One of them dismounted and came over to me. With profuse apologies for disturbing me, he handed me the warrant. There is no necessity for me to relate what I told them. The result was satisfactory, for the party rode off at once, only too glad to see the last of Salinas. Shortly afterwards, the invading army began commandeering horses from the Cordobes ranches, so Papa made me captain of 30 or 40 Colombian horse wranglers, one of the toughest crowds I ever saw. Thanks to the fearless devotion to duty of my command, our reputation soon spread abroad until nobody wearing a uniform of any description dared show his face within the limits of the Cordobes property. Of our many adventures among the rock-bound fastnesses above the clouds, I have no time to speak. One of our greatest successes was when we rounded up a party of horse thieves and stampeded them in the dark until they piled themselves up on a barbed wire entanglement which we had erected for the occasion. When there was no more fun to be had, I resigned my captaincy and went back to Salinas, much to the disappointment of my pastuzos, as the natives of Pasto in Colombia are called, who wanted me to return with them to their hometown. They would make me a colonel, start a revolution, and run me for president. I am afraid I missed a career when I declined, for those fellows would have followed me anywhere. Naturally, my efforts resulted in my being unpopular with Alfaro's lieutenants in general, and the governor of Granda in particular. As a matter of fact, before I left Salinas for the last time, old Cordobes used this as an argument in favour of my leaving the country. Not that I cared much for that kind of pressure. Excuse me. Next, I come to the point where I arrived at Riobamba, after leaving the salt mine to look after itself. When I arrived there, I was faced by two things: my unpopularity with the Cordobes family, and my unpopularity with the government. My relations with Papa were considerably strained, so much so that I took my empty trunk and stayed at a hotel, a worse dwelling place than my hut in Salinas. As for the government, it was then that I realized that I was constantly exposed to the risk of being molested by some of the hordes of independent and quite unreliable minor officials of state, as a result of my having dabbled in politics with such distinction. As I sat down to think it over, and made the decision that led me into the heart of the unknown world that lies beyond the Andes, I resolved then and there, instead of returning to Guayaquil and shipping for the States, I would go up to Quito, cross the eastern Cordillera into the valley of the river Napo, make my way down that river to the Marañón, and so down the Amazon to Pará, whence a steamer would take me to New York. I'd finished with Ecuador. So I rode out of Riobamba on a hired mount along the desert trail which leads to Ambato, from which the carretera starts for Quito. Through the boulder-strewn valley of Riobamba I went, the dumping ground of Sangay, Cotopaxi, and Tungarahua, from which steam and smoke still continued to spout. I stayed the night at Ambato, where I shared a room, in the approved Ecuadorian fashion, with a man and his wife. In those days, before the light railway from Guayaquil to Quito was built, a stagecoach ran from Ambato to the capital along the carretera on which were built, at 10-mile intervals, relay stations. The coaches themselves were built along the lines of the old Deadwood coach, and were pulled by 6 mules, 4-wheelers with a pair of leaders. 3 had been broken into harness, while 3 were fresh from the ranch, the latter being hitched up blindfold. Everybody mounted, while the muleteers stood by to give us a good send-off. The 2 drivers climbed to their seats, and the word was given. The ponchos were snatched away from the wild mules' heads, the drivers cracked their whips, stamped and whistled, and the stable hands standing around hurled rocks at the leaders. We shot away like an arrow from a bow. Except for a few bad stretches, the animals kept at a run for the whole 10 miles until we reached the first station. Then the whole comedy was played over again, and so on until we made Quito at the end of a tumultuous day. In the capital, I put up at the Hotel Paris, the best in the place. I had a suite of rooms, 4 meals a day, wine served in pitchers, and 2 private servants always at my disposal, for the sum of 16 sucres, about $8 gold, per month. As if to counterbalance so much luxury, however, the sanitary arrangements, on which subject I was by this time becoming an expert, were somewhat deficient. The hotel, I may say, was no exception, for there was not one single cabinet of any description in the whole city. Now, we've got a little footnote here. He understands that the state of affairs has since been remedied and that there are now at least 20. Instead, there was the Cuidado Abajo system. Those who have walked in the streets of such towns will be acquainted with the risk of disregarding the cry, "Look out below." It precedes the ejection of refuse onto the pavement from an upper window. As for the ultimate fate of the refuse, which lies about the streets and patios, it's sun-dried, powdered by the hooves of animals, and finally blown away. There are no turkey buzzards in Quito. I mention these points for it struck me that that was a very remarkable state of affairs to find in a capital city. One of the first things I did on my arrival was to call on our minister, Mr. J.D. Tillman, a typical member of our consular service. I was carrying a letter of introduction from the Honorary Warren Miller, and Mr. Tillman did everything he could for me, not only then, but afterwards. Among many other things, he introduced me to President Alfaro, whom he requested to furnish me with a passport which would see me safely beyond the jurisdiction of the Republic. For Mr. Tillman's courteous assistance I have always been grateful. Here I may mention that the American population of Quito consisted, apart from the minister himself and his wife, of a certain Mr. Solomon Sturman, the owner of a small general store, but reputed to be one of the wealthiest men in the city, and the source from which the government obtained most of its ready cash, and a Mr. Budzikowski, a boilermaker from Poland via New York, who mended watches in a shop he had in the main street. There was only one place in Quito where you could take a bath, and that was only open during ordinary business hours. One day I was in Sturman's store, and he turned to me and asked me to do him the favour of keeping an eye on his employees while he went out to the baths, as he'd been unable to take a bath for weeks. That was how I learned that in Quito no partnerships were formed, and no shopkeeper dare leave his clerks in charge for 5 minutes. Indeed, commercial morality was of such a low order that there was not even a bank in the city. Had there been one, no one would have been found who would open an account. I cannot suppress a smile at the thought of an Ecuadorian handing perfectly good money through a teller's window, the teller trying hard to conceal his pleasure. Suspicion runs in Spanish blood the world over, but Quito is the only place, I am sure, where every storekeeper unlocks his own store in the morning, sits there all day, locks it up at night, and sleeps with the key in his pocket. There is a story going about the capital when I was there about a partnership which was once formed. One of the partners went to Europe to buy. Returning, he found that the other had sold up the store and run away with his wife. What struck me most was that my informant pronounced that, of course, the man who went to Europe was un pobre pendejo, a despicable object, and the other was muy inteligente, very smart. And that was the verdict of the whole town. Sturman must have weighed 250 pounds and had muscles on him like an ox. The first time I was in his store, he rolled up his sleeve and asked me what I thought would happen to the first man he hit. Next day, I learned that the government had lent him a permanent guard of 4 soldiers with fixed bayonets to escort him between his store and the hotel where he took his meals, on account of his being threatened by a £100 Italian shopkeeper, whom he had once robbed. Sturman was illiterate and absolutely unprincipled. He once tried to pass off bad money on me, and later succeeded in persuading me to part with my 1,000 sucre interest in an electrical concession for 250. On the social side of Quito, I could write a volume, but the present occasion is not one for the lengthy discussion of this fascinating topic. Suffice it to say that the social strata are very clearly defined. First comes a group of old, blue-blooded, pure Spanish families, a dozen or so. Next, the official and diplomatic clique. Afterwards, the merely rich. Finally, what corresponds to our lower middle classes. All social life is a paradox, a mixture of rigid convention and unbridled licentiousness, which is most strongly marked among the highest classes. There was at that time little education, and culture was the name given to a detailed knowledge of local etiquette. After a few gay months, I became tired of waiting to put my resolution into practice, and one day applied for my passport at the Palacio. I was duly presented with a magnificent document and returned to Mr. Tillman's office to say goodbye and write my farewell letter home. I have the letter still. I append a few quotations from it, as showing how little the happy-go-lucky boy who wrote it knew what he was attempting. It is the best possible insight into my state of mind on that last day in Quito. Quito, January 9th, 1897. Dear Mother, I am in the office of Mr. Tillman, the American minister, and am writing the last communication you will receive until you see me at home. My expedition is ready, and I start tomorrow on foot for the Napo forest, with about 600 miles with the Indians, who will carry my equipment. I expect to encamp upon the Napo River, a small creek and a tributary of the Marañon River, which enters the Amazon about 3,000 miles from its mouth, for about 1 month, in order to build my canoes for the 4,000-mile trip. I take absolutely no money with me, except sufficient for my journey from Pará to New York. My small fortune I have invested in machetes, beads, and trinkets for the Indians. It will be useless to write me on receipt of this letter, as I will be upon the way down the Napo, shooting the rapids at the rate of 150 miles per day in a dugout and bounding down towards the great Amazon, where I will embark in a steamboat for Para. I will arrive in Para sometime in March or April, but perhaps sooner, so don't fail to send me the necessary papers at once. If I show up at the American consul's office without a haircut or shave for half a year, and without letters of introduction, he will surely throw me out. Don't worry about me, for remember that I will be happy, and your home is my haven, and every hour I will be nearer you. Some people will criticize me quite severely for attempting such a difficult trip to satisfy my love for adventure. But we would never have been discovered yet if Columbus had remained at home, and the Garden of Eden would have been full long ago if someone hadn't gone outside to look about. I am going, as I say, for a business venture, for a bit of adventure, and nothing more. I don't care to have my picture in the telegram, and I don't expect even to write a book. Your affectionate son, F. W. Up de Graaf.